Hello and welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Catherine McClellan with Black Crow. And following on from last week's theme of thinking about some recent science news, I want to go over some more stories that have come out in the last week or so. And actually this has been quite an interesting week with things that range all the way from conservation news to news about neurological findings to things that have to do with medicine, so kind of all over the place, and I've tried to pick out the best stuff, the most interesting and kind of exciting sorts of results that I could find. And the first of these has to do with birds, of course one of my favorite topics, and in this case the researchers in question have looked at crows, corvids in general, but crows specifically, because they were trying to figure out why it is that this group of birds is so intelligent. And we kind of know certain kind of larger scale things about why they're intelligent, and we know a little bit about their brain structure and their kind of social interactions with each other. But what we don't know a whole lot about is kind of what's happening on a smaller scale, so the neuronal basis of the intelligence of these birds. And we know that the birds do a lot of things that are quite similar to things that humans and other mammals do as well. So things like making and using tools and remembering a lot of really detailed spatial information. So for example, the details of where a site is where they might cache some food that they want to go back to, or places where they know they can find food or they know they can find other things they might be interested in reliably time after time. Also information about, kind of breeding sites and places that they prefer to be because they're nice and safe, or they're particularly good in some characteristic or another. And they also are able to plan their social behavior according to the actions of other birds around them. So a lot of this stuff is quite similar to things that we see in humans. And what's kind of fascinating about this is not so much that they do these things, because we know lots of animals that do things kind of along these lines, but the fact that they're actually able to do it using brains that are organized very differently from how our brains are organized. And a lot of the other animals that show these sorts of behaviors have brains that are similar to ours. And so it is quite an interesting thing to think, how is it that birds are able to do this, and how does that compare and contrast to how we're able to do these tasks? And what does this mean about kind of the evolution of brains in general? And so what happened in the study that's recently come out is that there were some researchers from Tübingen in Germany who investigated brain physiology of intelligent behavior, or behavior that we would look at and say, wow, that requires quite a lot of thought capacity in these birds. And it was the first time anyone has ever actually looked at the physiology of the brain and how the brain is working while these functions were occurring. So what they did is they trained a bunch of crows to carry out memory tests on a computer. And I know it kind of sounds strange to think of people having birds figure out how to do a certain task and how to interact with a computer, but actually that's not all that unusual. Birds have been tested with computers for a really long time, and this is just kind of the most recent permutation of this. And what these guys did was show them an image that needed to be remembered in order to get some sort of a reward. And in some cases, the birds were asked to remember something that looked similar to what they were being asked to look at later on, or to remember something that looked different to what they were being asked. So they basically had to memorize this thing, and then later they were shown two images, and they either had to pick the one that was like what they'd already seen, or one that was different from what they'd already seen. And they were asked to do these things under different circumstances, and sometimes they got the reward for picking the similar thing, sometimes they got the reward for picking the different thing, and they didn't know at the outset what activity was going to get the reward, so they kind of had to see the rules of the game, figure it out, and then switch their behavior accordingly. So all of this, as you can imagine, takes quite a lot of complex thought and quite a lot of flexibility and adaptability. And what they found was that the birds were able to complete both types of tasks, and they could switch between them whenever they needed to. So they were able to do all this kind of flexible stuff with their brains. And they also were able to do this quite quickly, and also apply the rules that they'd learned to new sets of images. So it wasn't just that they had learned these very specific image A, image B, image C. They actually kind of got the gist of how the whole interaction was occurring, the fact that they were either remembering something similar or something different, regardless of what it looked like, and then they could apply that across the board. So this is quite advanced sort of thought to see in these animals. And all the time that this was happening, the researchers were monitoring the activity of the birds' brains. And what they found was that there was lots of activity in a particular region called the Nidopallium caudolaterale, or however one actually pronounces that. And this is associated with higher levels of cognition. And we know this kind of from the past, but people hadn't really paid a whole lot of attention to this particular brain region. And what they found in this particular context was that there was one group of nerve cells that was responding exclusively when the crows were choosing the same image, and there was another group of cells that were responding only when the birds were choosing the different image. So by looking at the brain activity, the researchers could actually predict, before the birds did their behavior, what behavior they were going to do. So clearly there was, a particular kind of format to how the brain regions would light up and which regions would light up, and this was indicating that there were discrete sections of the brain being devoted to these different types of behavior. And so this is quite a valuable insight, because it does allow researchers to begin to think about this kind of parallel evolution of intelligent behavior. So birds with their bird brains and their bits that we don't necessarily have, and their cells within those little bits. And then mammals, and in particular primates, and the different kind of regions that we have, and the different areas within those regions that do different things. And now this allows us to kind of look across all these different ways of achieving the same thing and think about, why and how do we arrive at these same solutions but in very different ways. So we can accomplish the same tasks, but we have different structures to do that. Now, of course, the reason we have those different structures is that we had very different evolutionary histories. We had different ancestors at some point. Obviously, we do all go back to the same very early ancestor, but later on we did branch apart. We had different environments that we were living in. We needed to accomplish different things in those environments, and so our brains kind of went off in different directions. But we did ultimately kind of converge on being able to do these same tasks in the end. And now researchers can look at this and kind of find the similarities, find the differences, and think about how evolution works and why it should work to accomplish those different things in those different ways. And potentially this stuff is interesting not just kind of in a theoretical sense and for just understanding the world, but also in kind of real-world applications. So if you think about it, computers are kind of like brains. They just happen to be machines. And potentially if we understand how these different kind of series of networks work to accomplish the thought process and to accomplish choice and other things that we use our brains for, then maybe you could think about structuring computers differently in order to achieve tasks in that same way. Also, you might kind of use it in networking analysis and thinking about the flow of information, the flow of diseases, the flow of money, who knows what. So anything that kind of links people with each other, or in whatever individuals of whatever species with each other, and kind of the flow of things between those individuals. And also thinking about information transfer. So for example, people are really interested in this now when they're looking at kind of social networks online and kind of how the media works and getting information out to people. How do we contact people in emergencies? So all these sorts of situations that involve the flow of information and the connection of lots of little things within one larger network, all of that actually can be influenced by what we find about how the brain works, because that's how the brain functions. It is also lots of little connections that work towards a common goal. So all these sorts of things that we begin to understand might be able to influence that sort of stuff, as well as helping us understand kind of the evolutionary process and also the behaviors of particular animals. Now the next study that I want to talk about also is about brains, and this one is kind of interesting because it's focused on looking at how brains became larger. And I have talked about this topic a little bit in the past, and thinking about how humans are kind of interesting, not just humans but primates in general are kind of special and interesting because of the size of our brains. And I've talked about how the fact that ours are quite large, and of course one of the ways that they have so much area, and not just volume but also surface area, is because they have all of those little folds on the cranium. And this is all quite an interesting thing that's happened. We don't see a whole lot of this in other species. It does seem to distinguish us from other species. And so people are really interested in thinking about, why do we have all those little folds? Why do we have such a huge size? And this is not just in the evolutionary sense, because obviously we know that these things make us quite intelligent. And so we know evolutionarily that animals that had that would have done a bit better, and so they would have passed that trait on to their offspring. But more like kind of what's the underlying genetic basis that facilitates this sort of thing? How did it become possible to even have brains of this size? And so this is something that people are interested in, not just to understand kind of the evolutionary history of how humans and other kind of highly intelligent animals became separated from other individuals that don't have such a high ratio of brain to body size, but also just thinking about kind of the trade-offs of this and how it is that it did ultimately become something that we could sustain. So we know that having brains is quite costly for lots of different reasons. So they do burn a lot of energy, and they're quite difficult to carry around. It's kind of awkward to have this big thing sitting up on our shoulders. It can be quite difficult in childbirth. Things that have big brains have a long developmental time, and so you do have to have the parents caring for their young for quite a long period of time. So all these things could actually be seen as kind of a downside of having these big brains, and yet we do see this happening in lots of different species, particularly in our primate lineage. And so researchers have been kind of investigating this to see what are the underlying molecular characteristics that could give rise to this trait. And in this particular study, researchers looked at the genomes of 39 different species of animals in order to understand this genetic basis for this particular characteristic. And gene families, you might already have heard this phrase and know what this means, but in case you don't, they're groups of related genes that share similar characteristics, and they're often linked because they have common or related biological functions. So these are kind of groups of genes that maybe work together or at least work in similar ways to accomplish some sort of task. And researchers have found previously that large changes in the size of gene families can help explain how and why related species evolved along different paths. So basically you can have one species that's kind of like another because they do have this shared ancestor, and then in that ancestor some number of individuals suddenly had some kind of a genetic change, or maybe they had a mutation, maybe they had a big diversification in these gene families, and suddenly you've got lots of genes that are available to do tasks that couldn't have been done before. Or you just simply have more things that are creating lots of products, so a particular task that was already being done can now be done in an even bigger way. So whatever the case might be, you suddenly have this change, and that change is often linked to a gain in function or a gain in some characteristic. Now, it doesn't always go well, but it does sometimes turn out well for the individuals. And so this is what the researchers were looking at. Did this kind of thing happen such that suddenly animals that have all of these changes in gene families are now able to have different sizes of brains? And indeed what they found when they looked across these 39 different species was that there were clear links between the number of gene families, or in fact a change in number of gene families, and the size of brain. And what they found was that, in particular, gene families that were related to things like cell communication and cell movement and also immune functions, particularly in gene families that did these things and were expressed prominently in the brain, all of these are related to variations in human brain size. So this suggests that perhaps the development or expression of these genes has somehow helped support large brains. So for example, maybe all of these things allowed humans to have fewer metabolic demands of having these big brains, or maybe these things have actively caused brain growth. For example, maybe they led to longer developmental periods or some sort of morphological change that affected brain size. Now obviously more research is going to be needed to understand whether these things are kind of cause and effect or whether they are symptoms. It simply happens to be related, or what exactly is the nature of this correlation between these two traits. But hopefully researchers can look into that, because it would be quite interesting to have a better idea of how it is exactly that the modern human brain came into being. And of course this is a really fundamental thing to what we are as humans, because we don't just have intelligence, we also have consciousness, and we're able to do really amazing, complex, creative, artistic sorts of things that we don't always see in other species. And so understanding the nature of the evolution of the brain can really help us understand a whole lot about what we do and kind of what our place is in the evolutionary tree. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Dr. Caitlin Kight, and that was Beck with Cold Brains. And if you are just joining us, before the break I was talking about some recent science news, and in this case the news had to do with kind of neurological and cognitive sorts of things, and I do want to get back to that topic later, but for now I'm going to go off on a topic that's a bit more exciting, for some of you anyway, and that is the topic of sex and how sex might affect lifespan. And this is a study that was conducted in fruit flies, so it may or may not be directly applicable in humans, but we do know that a lot of trends that we see in fruit flies do actually have some implications for other species, and there are some kind of things that we have in common. And so, pay attention, this might actually be useful information to you sometime. So just to cut to the chase, to give you the actual finding, researchers looked at fruit flies and found that more sex was related to a longer lifespan, whereas less sex resulted in a shorter lifespan. And they found this out by kind of introducing males to males that seemed like females that weren't. And this allowed them to kind of look at everything associated with the act of sex except for the actual mating event itself. So they genetically engineered these males to unnaturally produce female pheromones, and they also manipulated pheromone perception neurons in the focal males, and they could manipulate the sexual reward centers in the brain. And so this meant that basically they could make the males think they were around females, they could enhance the male's ability to smell those females and to think maybe that there are more than there actually were. Well, not there were any at all, but each of the males that they saw around them they would have thought was a female, but if they manipulated these neurons, they could make them think there was even more pheromone and potentially even more potential females around them. And then they also were able to manipulate the sexual reward centers of the brain to make the males think that they had experienced some sort of a mating event. So this is, pretty serious stuff that they were able to do with these tiny little flies. And what they found was that flies that perceived pheromones but had no chance to mate experienced decreases in fat stores, resistance to starvation, and also just more stress. And ultimately, after going through all of these unpleasant things, they ended up living shorter lives. And then they found that flies that were able to mate, eventually, exhibited partial reversals of all of these trends. So it kind of mitigated all of those problems that were associated with the sexual frustration, for lack of a better phrase. And these guys were also generally healthier and longer lived. So basically, there are kind of two big things that this study has found. And one of these is that, there are all these myths all this time that sexual frustration is quite bad for you. And people have often thought that that's kind of an old wives' tale and it was just an excuse that was being used by people who just wanted to have sex. But actually it looks like it might truly be bad for at least some species to have such desire and then not able to go through with it in some way or another. And it's actually could shorten your life by causing a whole bunch of stress. And then the other thing is that the study does indicate that aging and physiology could be influenced by how the brain is processing expectations and rewards. And this might not just be sex, but any of those things. So anything that you might perceive and really, really want, but then not be able to have in some way. So sex is really only one of these. Food might be another example. Any kind of reward that's out there in the environment might be another as well. And so this is actually quite interesting in a very broad scale, because this could have a lot to do with kind of, of course, patterns in humans, but also if you think about happiness and how happiness affects your health. So kind of the mind-body sort of connection. And these neurological processes might kind of join those two things up. And it's quite difficult to think about, how these results might be applied just yet. As I said, findings in Drosophila and fruit flies have been applied elsewhere in other species, such as lab mice. So they might actually have some implications for humans. But the truth is also that these kind of basic underlying patterns in brains, even if they don't apply in exactly the same way in people, there probably are similar processes occurring within us. So it might be quite interesting to look at other species, look at humans, and see if we see similar sorts of patterns, whether in this exact scenario or not. Although it's kind of interesting to think of the moral and ethical implications of doing a similar study in people. But certainly you can begin to think about how these findings relate to previous findings that have found that dietary restriction and lifespan are related. So I mentioned that it's not just sex, but anything that might be desired or needed that could have an impact on these kind of stress responses. And we have found in the past that animals that eat less do tend to have longer lifespans. And so it's quite interesting to think how all these little pieces of the puzzle fit together to determine how long an individual animal could eventually live. So, just as I promised, I am going to get back to a little bit of cognition yet again. I suppose actually that was kind of cognition as well. But this is a bit more directly cognitive in nature. And this is looking at, this study was looking at the brain region that is responsible for making up your mind. And this is one that actually was done in rats rather than in flies this time around. In this case, researchers were training lab rats to choose between two different types of rewards. And on the one hand, they could have a consistent reward that was kind of small, so they could have one food pellet, but they always knew that they could rely on actually getting that food pellet. Or they could have a larger reward that would only appear sporadically. In this case, it was 4 food pellets, so that's 4 times the amount as the other one, but they weren't always sure that they actually would get it. So of course, one of these is kind of a high-risk situation, and one of them is a low-risk situation. And the high-risk situation would kind of pay off if you did ultimately get that thing, because it is 4 times as big as the other option. But if you don't get it, if you gamble and then don't get it, that's obviously going to be, quite a bummer. It could be quite costly if you're very hungry or if you haven't eaten for a while. So what they found when they looked at how rats kind of, weighed these options is that they tended to choose the larger rewards when the costs were low. So when it wasn't such a big deal, if that sporadic thing didn't show up, they went ahead and tried for it more often. But they preferred the smaller rewards when the risks were higher, and they were happy to accept just a single pellet if conditions around them were kind of unsure and they weren't always, confident that they would actually get some sort of food or not. And in this case, the cost was measured as the amount of time that the rats had to wait before they received the food. So when they knew kind of the amount of time, from experience, they would have to go through this scenario a few times. When they knew that there was a long time, they would happily just take that one pellet. But when they knew it actually wasn't going to be that long, they would go ahead and wait and have the 4 pellets in the end. And interestingly, similar studies have been done in humans and with the same results. So people tend to also be cautious or not, depending on kind of what is at stake. And some of these previous studies have suggested that there's a small part of the brain, known as the lateral habenula, that might be related to this choice process. And in the past, this part of the brain has been linked to depression and also avoidance behaviors. So it's quite interesting that something that has those connections might also be related to choosing things and kind of processing risk in the environment and balancing costs and benefits and weighing which option is better. And so, because of this previous finding about this particular part of the brain, researchers suspected that rats that had had this bit disabled would be more likely to choose the larger and riskier reward more often. And in fact, what they found was it wasn't the opposite, but it was actually kind of a neutral thing. So when the lateral habenula was disabled, and of course this was something that the researchers did experimentally, the rats basically chose at random. So they weren't weighing any options at all. They were just kind of doing a thing. So about half of the time they would do the riskier thing, and about half the time they would do the safer thing. And this really suggests that that part of the brain is a very important bit in the decision-making process. And in humans, interestingly, this part of the brain has been inactivated in kind of a medical situation using a process known as deep brain stimulation. And the reason that this has been done is because doctors have found that it can improve depressive symptoms. So people are feeling less depressed at the end of that stimulation. And what they had thought for a long time was that they were feeling happier because of this stimulation to the part of the brain. But actually what it turns out, based on these studies, is that what really might be happening is that the patients simply don't care, that they're kind of in a neutral state rather than a positive state because of this this part of the brain's activity. And this is kind of the first step in maybe understanding what's going on in these other psychiatric disorders that also involve impairment or change to the decision-making process. So things like schizophrenia and stimulant abuse and depression, all of these sorts of things do alter how we make decisions. So if we're able to understand the parts of the brain that are associated with that process and what happens when that part is active or is not active, then maybe we can begin to understand how we can treat these problems. And it's not also just looking at the parts and looking at whether they're on or off, but also thinking about the connections among them. So kind of the order in which information is processed and sent from one bit to the next might have a really important role in how eventually the person or the animal chooses to behave. So this is kind of an intriguing thing that by no means is the answer or the solution to any problem, but it certainly begins to point us in a new direction that we can look in order to try to figure out what's happening in people that have these sorts of conditions and how we can improve their lives. Welcome back to The Wild Side. That was Feist with The Circle Married the Line. And today on The Wild Side I'm talking about some recent science news. And the next study that I want to talk about is one that does in fact look at marriage, hence the song. And this one is one that you may have heard a little bit about because it has been quite a thing in the popular press. And that's because it looked at humans, and that's always kind of interesting to people, but also it looked at whether they have subconscious knowledge of how their marriages are going to turn out. And studies like this can always be kind of contentious because people get riled up about these sorts of kind of personal things. But this one was quite interesting, and it had a pretty decent sample size, so 135 different couples were examined. And all these guys had been married within the past 6 months or so, and were interviewed quite early on in the marriage, and then repeatedly every 6 months over the subsequent 4 years. So that's quite a fair amount of data for these people who had just been married. And they were asked to give some preliminary baseline data, and then after that, they repeated a bit of that, but mostly it was just kind of checking in to see how they felt about how things were going. And what the researchers ultimately found was that the people verbalized certain things about their marriages, so they said, yes, it's great, or no, it's not going so well. But actually, what they said specifically didn't really have any strong correlation with how their marriages were turning out. So whether their marital happiness was actually related to the words that they used to describe how the marriage was going or how their spouses were, things like that. So these things that people are actively sharing aren't necessarily that informative. But what they found was that this kind of gut level information that they provided early on at that baseline period was something that actually maybe was a bit more interesting and said a bit more about how they really did feel later on in the marriage. So let me explain what exactly I mean by all that. So there were two portions of the study, and one was a conscious portion and one was a subconscious portion, if you will. That's kind of a non-scientific way of talking about it. But in the conscious portion, the newlyweds were asked to report their relationship satisfaction and also to talk about the severity of specific relationship problems. And then they were also asked to provide conscious evaluations of how the marriage was going by describing various aspects of it according to 15 different pairs of opposing adjectives. So for example, they were given good and bad, satisfied and unsatisfied, that sort of thing, and they had to pick which one of those was most applicable to their marriage. So that is pretty straightforward, but the interesting bit was the less straightforward part, and that's the unconscious or subconscious portion of the study. And here the individuals were placed in front of computers, and the computers were used to display a photo of each person's partner. And the photos were only flashed up really briefly, so about a third of a second, and after each photo there was either a positive word, so something like awesome or terrific, or a negative word, so something like awful or terrible. And as soon as individuals saw that word, they had to press a key on the keyboard to indicate whether that word was positive or negative. And the researchers measured the amount of time it took for the people to press that key. And as you might imagine, this is not that hard of a task. All you're doing is kind of just plopping your finger down. But there are really subtle differences in timing that depend on how people actually feel about their partners. So people that have positive feelings, especially really strong positive feelings, will quite quickly respond to those positive words. But people that have really negative feelings will respond really quickly to negative words. And this has to do with the fact that it's easier to do something that's called a congruent cognitive process than one that's incongruent. So in other words, it's hard to switch gears and be positive when you're thinking negatively. So if you see your partner's picture and you think, oh man, he's driving me crazy right now, then it's going to take you a longer time to respond to the word awesome or terrific. But if you are really getting along well with your partner, if things are really good in your relationship, you're going to feel much more positive. So when you see that positive word, you're going to respond and move your finger really quickly. And obviously this will be quite a subtle thing because we can move keys, move our hands pretty fast. But this is enough that there is enough of a difference that researchers can measure this by looking at how long it takes for that key to actually be depressed. And what's really amazing is that these subconscious data were only collected a single time, and so it only happened right at the beginning of the study. But they were still found to be closely related with the later attitudes. And that's a really fascinating thing, is that people know quite early on whether things are going well or not, even if they're not admitting it to themselves. And so if they are quite positive early on, if there is kind of a good rapport going on, then that does seem to lead to a better relationship later on in the marriage. Whereas if there is kind of a hint that something's going wrong early on, there's that kind of gut reaction where you see your partner and maybe it's not actually the happiest moment of your life, then that also seems to carry through and mean that the marriage later on won't be quite as pleasant as you might have hoped. So people who did unknowingly reveal these kind of negative or lukewarm attitudes did later report the most marital dissatisfaction over that kind of 4-year follow-up period. But conscious attitudes were not related, as I said. Those things that they were verbalizing, however those things came out, negative or positive, didn't really seem to closely relate to how the marriage actually went. So this discrepancy might reflect the fact that people really want to be happy, and so they kind of convince themselves that they are happy. So that means they're able to talk about their weddings and their relationships as though they are quite pleasant, and they can verbalize everything in a glowing manner, even if underneath it all, that's not how they feel at all. And that's, of course, because wishful thinking doesn't actually change your feelings, and so these automatic kind of gut-level responses, as the authors called them, are sometimes more accurate. And this, of course, means that if people do have these sorts of feelings, if you kind of poke around inside you and find those sorts of things, actually it's really worth paying attention to those things. If you do have cold feet, it might actually be something more than just nervousness. There might be this bit of hesitation. And these are good warning signs that potentially you can get help for your relationship, or maybe you need to end your relationship altogether. And it's, obviously not up to me to be offering any relationship advice, but I do find it fascinating that we do have these really good instincts, and sometimes we ignore them, and sometimes we don't. And actually, it looks like if you do pay attention to them, it maybe could pay off, at least in this case. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Michael Kiwanuka with Bones. And I picked that song because the next little bit of recent science news that I want to discuss is the discovery of a new carnivorous dinosaur. And paleontologists have discovered this dinosaur in Utah, in the U.S., in a section of the country called the Cedar Mountain Formation. And actually this was discovered in 2008, but it wasn't fully described and published until just this year. And this dinosaur was likely the apex predator of its time, so the biggest thing, the most dominant thing, and it outcompeted species of similarly shaped tyrannosaurs. So we all know Tyrannosaurus rex, but there were other species in that same family, and they kind of had that same body plan. And that's what this guy looked like, but was quite large. And the species is named Ciats meekerorum, and it was discovered in the format of a partial skeleton, and this was actually of a juvenile rather than an adult. And even though it wasn't a whole skeleton or an adult, researchers could still kind of scale up and determine that this was definitely one of the top 3 largest ever carnivores discovered in North America. And if they had found a full-size specimen, it likely would have been over 30 feet long and weighed at least 4 tons. And this is just a juvenile, so adults, of course, would have been even bigger. so probably the size of a species known as Acrocanthosaurus. And both of these things are kind of, because they are so close, would have been in the running to be the second largest predator ever discovered. So both the new species and the Acrocanthosaurus are members of a single group known as, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Carcharodontosaurs. And these are all large meat-eating animals. And the Seats is in a different subgroup as the Acrocanthosaurus, and it's something called a Neovinatoridae, which is more slender bodied, but they do kind of have similar feeding focuses. And other members of that group have been found all over the world, in places like Europe and South America, China, Australia, so they're really quite widespread. And these two particular species, the species, were the only ones that were actually known ever from North America. So the Seats is actually quite an important addition to kind of what's been found across the country and across the continent, because there aren't too many species from the Carcharodontosaur family. And the Acrocanthosaurus came about 10 million years earlier than the one that was just found, and was also discovered earlier, so it was found in 1950. And that means that there hasn't been something like this discovered for about 63 years. So paleontologists were really excited when they found this guy. So as I said, it was found in the Utah area, so of course that's where it would have been living, but probably also elsewhere throughout the country. And it would have been living there during the late Cretaceous period, which is about 100 to 66 million years ago. And in the past, researchers had wondered which species would have been the dominant predator during that time, because they hadn't really found anything that was living in that period. They had stuff from before, they had stuff from after, and they didn't really know who was around in that time that was filling that role. And now, of course, they do. And so what's kind of cool about this is that it's a species that was involved in what they call a handover of dominance from the Carcharodontosaurs in the early Cretaceous to the Tyrannosaurs in the late Cretaceous. And now that they have found this species and identified it, the dynamics of that kind of handover event are now much clearer. So the Seats would have been around at the same time as those Tyrannosaurs, but really outcompeting them and basically holding them in check and not ever allowing them to grow to a certain size or to take over a certain amount of the ecosystem. But once this larger species died out, the Tyrannosaurs would have been the next big thing, and so then they were able to kind of diversify and take over. And that's the context in which the T-Rex would have been able to evolve. And the T-Rex, of course, I said earlier that those other two species were tied for place number 2 in terms of the size of the animals found at that time. Well, T-Rex is number 1, so it's the largest land predator ever. And so this was facilitated by the vanishing of this previous large species. And that allowed T-Rex to come in and eventually evolve to become twice the weight of the Seats, which is obviously quite a massive animal if you consider the fact that the other one was about 4 tons. So researchers say that in the same time that they found this Seats species, they also found several other interesting stuff in that same dig from the same period, and this includes 2 other species that had not been previously known to science. So all of that information will be coming out soon as well. And I used to want to be a paleontologist when I was a kid, so I find it absolutely amazing that after all this time, they are still finding new species, and it always is just as exciting as it was when I was little, and I used to go to the museum and see these things. So I kind of didn't go into that career because I thought that everything interesting would have been found, and obviously I was wrong, which is really neat because I still get to read about it, even if I don't get to go out there and do it myself. So I believe that pretty much wraps it up for me today. I had a couple other things I was going to go into if I had time, but unfortunately I'm just about out. So maybe I'll post these on the Wildside website so you can see these other kind of current events if you go visit. So for example, if you're interested in a bit more sex news, you might go find out about polyandry and salamanders, along with some other interesting things that I've rummaged up for you this week. So I hope you feel caught up with the science current events, and I'm going to wrap up with Robert Miles and children. Talk to you next week.